And good afternoon to our guests in Europe. Thank you all for attending today. We certainly hope that you and everyone that you care about remains safe and healthy during this global crisis. My name is Jerry Boyer, one of the founders of Harmonized Mobility. We are a Canadian firm focused on the workability of deploying new mobility technologies. Our work includes systems to connect and integrate ride-hailing and public transit. We also offer courses and workshops to help rationalize planning responses to the uncertainty in rapidly changing technologies and demands. And today's critical topic, the real-time coordination of for-hire vehicles for passengers, goods delivery vehicles, and later automated vehicles as they load and unload passengers and goods at our curbs and on our sidewalks. I'm going to leave everyone on mute for the first 30 minutes or so while Bern is presenting. Following the presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. The process to ask a question, you have the ability to type in your question in the control panel, in the question drop-down on the control panel, that is. You can also raise a hand and I will call on you to ask the question. I'll handle the mute and unmute process, and we'll do our best to get to all your questions. So now I want to introduce our co-founder, Bern Grush, to talk about a new project under the support and approval of the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. This project is designed to standardize real-time operations at the curbside and sidewalk for now and into the future. Bern is a 35-year veteran of the standards-making process, most recently working on 2 ISO standards related to electronic toll collection for road pricing. Without any further ado, Bern, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank all of you for taking some time away from your activities and families and for your interest in addressing the current and coming issues surrounding the deployment of our sidewalks and curbs. I'm going to use the word sidewalks here throughout my talk. This is synonymous with the word pavement in many, many other countries, but here we call it sidewalks. I hope all of you are safe and able to stay healthy in these circumstances. I know we all share the alarm and concern that our current situation represents. It is now becoming widely recognized that many of the expectations or hopes we had regarding the technologies, transit, planning, and automation are now in flux. What is already uncertain in regards to transit and transportation in all of its modes and formats has now become even more uncertain. The same is true in regards to budgets and funding for many of the programs we have been envisioning until now. One thing that is most likely to remain a focus of concern, regardless of all these changes, is our curb and sidewalk spaces. How we use them, optimize them, enjoy them, and monetize them. How we keep them safe, groomed, and livable. As this current crisis morphs into a recovery and reconfiguration of how we do some, and perhaps most things, the overall intensities of parking, ride-hailing, transit ridership, active transportation, e-commerce deliveries, microtransit, and micromobility will likely differ from what they were before this pandemic. But what is clear is that the sidewalk and curb will continue to grow in critical importance for space, access, competition, business, and hopefully urban enjoyment. We have largely focused our attention over the past century on the roadway. We have done this for reasons of moving people and freight in motorized vehicles. We have largely focused on the tension between speed and safety, trying to optimize each, usually to the detriment of the other. Relatively speaking, we have neglected the curb until recently. There has long been a struggle over how to park our overabundant vehicles that are idle more often than not. By the turn of the millennium, we have begun to express more focused concerns for proper management of parking, usually around pricing matters. Biking demand started to grow in many places, ride-hailing, e-commerce, all things demanding a bit more of the curb, and in the case of scooters and other micromobility devices, now beginning to spill onto our sidewalk. It is projected that we can expect driverless taxis to drop passengers at the curb, that delivery bots will be able to cover the last 100 meters across intersections and along sidewalks, dodging people, wheelchairs, pets, skateboarders, and garbage cans. One interesting potential is the notion of a large goods delivery vehicle parking near a number of delivery locations and proceeding to release a handful of sidewalk drones to operate within a modest radius. Some of these automation ideas are still a few years away, but we clearly already have an over-constrained curb with a growing variety and intensity of modes. There is no need to wait for automation for us to begin managing the curb as a collaborative logistics space. We need to incorporate into a single real-time logistics model the dynamics of parking, passenger loading, transit, express delivery, biking, and other modes. And that is the purpose of the work we are inviting you to engage in with us. How we handle the curb today has already begun to change. We distinguish three elements of this activity. On the left, mapping the physical inventory of the curb, sometimes called coding the curb. This is done by a number of service firms today. In the center, the activity of governing the curb includes bylaws, usage rights, pricing schedules and fees, enforcement guidelines, court services, etc. Then on the right, there is the daily real-time operation of the curb. That means, given the understanding of what is where and the management rules set by city council or traffic, parking, and transit planners, how are things handled right now at 9:15 a.m. today? And so today that is guided by signage, prices in some cases, and often enforced by parking or police officers, and sadly, sometimes in court. One key issue today is that these operations are fragmented, inefficient, and differ from location to location. The question posed now is, how will operations be handled in the future as the intensity of ride-hailing and e-commerce increases and as automation joins the competition for access to the curb? We and others propose that vehicle connectivity and urban networks and machine intelligence will handle this, hopefully smoothly. What our work is about is establishing a standard, it's an international standard, for data, communications, and protocols for systems to operate this new curb, with its related enforcement and monetization. Note that the standard we are describing would not set policy, numbers, prices, or schedules. Rather, it will set out the language and protocols to do that for mixed automated and non-automated real-time environments. Much and eventually all of this operation will be in the cloud, automated, and with human oversight. Much of that oversight likely remote and dynamic. Almost all of it in near real time, in a way similar to air traffic control. As time goes on, how the curb is currently operated will change completely. But this change will be gradual and needs this standard to guide that change. There are a lot of new scenarios to consider in the matter of real-time operation. These contemplate automation, but some apply to ride-hailing and goods delivery today. What happens when there are more vehicles than spaces, which is pretty common? Should they circle the block, park in the bike lane, stop inside the transit stop? It gets more interesting with sidewalk delivery drones. Will there be numeric limits for these devices placed per block? Perhaps including 0 in some cases. As the real-time problem grows and we use more connectivity, we need broader shared standards that interoperate among ride-hailing, logistics, transit, and automated versions of each of these. The sidewalk and curb are increasingly central to cities. There are now so many demands besides simply storing vehicles for a couple of hours that real-time management of these assets in some locations is already in failure mode. The ISO standard we have proposed and are launching has many stakeholders. Here are some of them. Many of you on this call are stakeholders. How this will turn out over the next few years will matter to your cities, to your businesses, and to your users. Notice that we put accessibility in a central position here. Our philosophy is that if we get accessibility right from the start, then the standard will work for everyone. This would save doing things over. So there are two bodies of collaborators. The stakeholders on the left, such as some of you might be, and the formal ISO technical committee and working group that ensures the correct structure, expression, research, clarity, and completeness of each ISO standard. As liaison between these two groups, our team brings all stakeholder concerns and ideas into the process. This is a valuable activity to ensure the standard is successful both in development and deployment. Prior to being considered for any ISO standards project, several things must be provided and accepted to the ISO's technical committee. One is a draft purpose and justification statement. A link to the formal draft of this was copied to each of you in the invitation to this webinar. In review, the 5 elements of this pertain to safety, planning, commerce, operations, and liability. If you did not see that document, we can resend it to you if you ask. There will be an email address at the end of this talk. The standard is somewhat ambitious, so we were asked to set out by ISO to set out a specific and limited scope for part 1. The other 3 parts will be described momentarily. But at this time, only part 1 is being approved and launched. The other 3 are already prepared and place held, but they have not been fully scoped yet. We will propose subsequent parts in sequence, which I will talk to you about in a moment. Part 1 is focused on foundational issues: data dictionary, terminology, architecture, hierarchies, and metrics for the standard and its documentation. Not mentioned here are the key issues of identifying all the foundational standards and specifications we need to build on. We have already started this aspect of the work. It is critical to base this new standard on as many existing standards and specifications as reasonable. There is every reason to learn from and be consistent with things that are already working and to be internally consistent within the new standard itself. Our first challenge is to harmonize such existing standards. There's really quite a number of them. And we will choose a number of these as a primary foundation and then merge and build from there. One example, the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, APDS, is an extensive and closely maturing standard to share parking data across platforms. Its data definitions will be important. Another one is the Kerb LR, LR means linear reference, open standard for describing curb regulations released less than a year ago. This provides a shared language for streets across jurisdictions, companies, and governments. These and others need to be harmonized within a normative base before we can build definitions for real-time operations. This work plan was submitted to the appropriate ISO technical committee. It happens to be called TC204 in October of 2019 in Singapore. It shows key milestones to reach publication of part 1 by June of 2022. Remember, there is much more to this than data definitions, standards research, and document structure. We need to detail the structure and communications protocols for operating at the curb and sidewalk, and then to integrate these. Hence, each part reaches a critical phase called committee draft. We will commence. As each part reaches the critical phase called committee draft, we will commence to the next part. I'll show you this cascade in a moment. First, let's look at the other 3 parts. Part 2 applies to data, categories, architecture, and research of part 1 for real-time curb use. This is a digitalized system that handles reservations, priorities, queuing, bumping, queuing in motion, which is similar to holding in a landing pattern for aircraft, and many other spatial and temporal alignments that needed to manage a mixed system of human-operated and software-operated vehicles, accessing the curb collaboratively, safely, and effectively. Part 3 does the same for sidewalks. Part 3 is harder than Part 2 because it must be done in a way to be able to integrate with Part 2, and real-time digital management is even newer on the sidewalk than it is at the curb. Part 4 considers the integration of sidewalk and curb. This is because automation is expected to eventually take goods from a warehouse to a curb and onto the sidewalk and into a building. Consider also the case of an automated paratransit vehicle bringing a person using an automated wheelchair to a curb and then to a sidewalk. Even the simple case of a sidewalk drone that can navigate from one sidewalk across an intersection, over the curb, and into the second sidewalk. So not only will the curb and sidewalk be the principal locus of common public activity and attention over the next decades, but the curb and sidewalk will become one flow for data, movement, automation, and monetization. I mentioned earlier that several parts of the full project will be staggered to be sure each stage is thoroughly researched and prepared, and that the entire project is completed as swiftly as possible. One thing that causes standards to take a considerable time is the number of readers, commenters, approvals, and ballots. In each case, as the bulk of a part is completed and begins its reviews and ballots, the next part will commence. One of the aspects of this project is that we think it is critical to have its user community grasp the overall purpose quickly. We envision a scheme of staged levels of automation to be used as a conceptual device by planners, developers, business associations, and municipalities. It would set rough expectations before specific details are worked out. This is merely an illustration mimicking the SAE levels for vehicle automation. When improved, we think this will be an important communication tool, in spite of the problems the SAE levels unleashed on the autonomous vehicle conversation. There are two key benefits to sponsorship and collaboration. If you are an operator, a maker, a planner, a municipal manager, and so on, a standard that addresses all of your needs is important. It will give you a head start and an easier time to innovate. If you are a user, whether business, resident, or visitor, then optimized, safer, effective sidewalks and curbs would work better for you. If they work better, then they create easier and larger markets for its operators, makers, planners, and managers as well. A win-win for all stakeholders. Many people in this webinar work with or for one of the stakeholder groups that I showed earlier, here again on the left. Of course, there are more than this, but this is representative. We think it is important that as many stakeholder facets as possible are represented. Remember that we made accessibility central to ensure cities do not spend inordinate effort repairing systems that did not properly consider accessibility at design time. We offer three things to our sponsors: quarterly written reports, which are the then current draft and ancillary commentary, a quarterly live video meeting to review and discuss. This is important for all stakeholders to see the total landscape. We will caution you clearly not to introduce any commercial IP to these discussions. The completed standard will be copyrighted to the ISO and will become globally available to anyone who pays its modest fee. But most important of all, you can propose additions and changes directly to the project leader, project editor, which is us. Any proposal will be considered, incorporated where possible, and as the formal ISO guidelines and processes permit. In other words, this is your standard. We're simply facilitating its construction. If you are interested to discuss, please email and we will set a time to talk. Jerry, now over to you for Q&A. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Bern, and thanks for walking us through that future-facing project. It's uh, it's now time to move into the Q&A section, and at this point in time, I don't see any questions typed in. So this is your opportunity to either type in questions within the questions drop down on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can raise your hand in the list, and I will handle the mute and unmute if you prefer to ask your question verbally. So let's take a look. So right now, Bern, I don't have any questions. What questions do you think they should be asking, Bern?
Well, I would ask how long this process might take. I would ask, how important really is it to be involved? Why not just wait for everybody else to do it? Those kinds of questions is some that I think of, but a lot of people in the past have asked specific questions about specific accessibility issues or specific municipal planning issues and so on. So those are the kinds of questions that are, I think, appropriate.
Perfect. Okay, so I do have a couple questions. Right now, I'm going to go to Barry Peckelis. I'm going to unmute you now, Barry, and just a second. Barry, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Ask your question.
Perfect. Yes, and good job. You got my last name right. So question for Bern. Thanks for the presentation. I had a couple questions. The first one is about curbside maintenance. For example, in the summer, you may have line painting. In the winter, the more obvious one in winter would be snow removal. Is that being, I didn't see that being considered, the idea of maintenance being considered. Is that an element? And then I'll have a second question after that.
So absolutely, not only is that a good question, but that is included. It's not, I didn't mention it specifically. I thought I mentioned snow at one point. There is already somebody that's involved in this who's involved with snow removal. In fact, that was part of the conversation yesterday at the ISO, was about automated maintenance. But it's not only snow, it's garbage removal, it's cleaning, street cleaning, and so on. And that will be included, but it's not included for us to say how often it must happen, but it is included to say that it must happen, and the specifications for that will be designed as a protocol, but the decision that it should be swept once a week or once a month or plowed when it's so many centimeters deep and so forth, those are local decisions, but we would be defining the protocol for how that's described.
Or in other words, a checklist, and then the local authority would figure out how they want to implement that.
That's right. The local authority says it's 5 centimeters or 3 centimeters for snow, or the local authority says it's swept once a month no matter what. But we are, yes, correct. We're providing not only the checklist, but we're providing the parameters so that that can be automated. So in other words, the systems that look after that eventually would be instructed when and how often to do whatever they're intended to do according to the actual numeric rules set out by the local authority.
Okay, makes sense. Second question is about reservation systems, and not just for parking, but also considering time of day. For example, you mentioned I might want to reserve the curb for garbage pickup at a certain time of day, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night. But I also may want different delivery services who want to know in advance that when they arrive at the curbside, there will be a spot for them. Similar to what they're doing in ports with truck reservation.
That's correct. That's actually the original prime motivation, or one of the two. There's a second prime motivation as well, but that's the first prime motivation, is actually reserving. So take for example a FedEx truck wants to come to a certain location and deliver something. That vehicle can't just park in the bicycle lane anymore. That doesn't work with automation. So that vehicle has to order ahead of time and receive a reservation slot exactly as you described. And then other things arise because the reservation slot that was prepared for it somehow is not vacated, let's say. And then we need to, somehow the system needs to tell that vehicle to pick a different spot or to come later and that sort of thing. So that's why I talked not only about reservation, but also about bumping and requeuing and so on. So it's exactly as you described, except harder.
So your answer triggered one last, I won't hog all the Q&A, but your answer kind of triggered another thought that came in my mind, and the word enforcement.
Right.
You know, if someone hasn't vacated when they're supposed to, how do you deal with enforcing the reservations?
So there's two answers to that. In the world, just imagine 80 years from now, in the world where everything is automated, if that ever happens, but imagine such a world, it's pretty easy to enforce that. So all machine enforcements and, you know, human oversight can take care of exceptions. The problem is between now and then, we're going to have a mixed environment. I mean, we're not going to get to 50% automation until we get to 1% automation. And so during that early time when we reserve a spot, there's going to be a lot of issues with people not understanding and people not bothering with the signs or people assuming they can get away with it. I'm talking about people in a car, that a human operated vehicle. And we're going to have a lot of problems like that. And that enforcement is going to have to be, I mean, right now we have camera systems that watch things, and you know, we could know from a distance that the spot is empty and that the truck which is reserved, it's going to have it when it gets there. And then we can see, oh, there's something in that spot, and then we need to deal with that somehow. And that requires human enforcement. So a human's going to have to go out and make sure that thing gets moved as now. I mean, that aspect is going to linger as long as we have human operators that are not respectful or not understanding or not paying attention. We're going to have that issue. I think we're going to have that issue for the next 30 years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me ask so many questions. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Barry. I'm going to put you on mute now. And Bern, I do have a list of questions, so I'm going to go to the list for a minute here. What is your schedule for completion of an acceptable, sorry, let me try that again, tongue-tied. What is your schedule for completion of an acceptable standard? And it has a follow-up question. Is that schedule aligned well with the deployment of automated curbside delivery, drop-off, etc.?
Okay, so I've thrown up this diagram. Each one of these arrows takes about, on average, 2 to 2.5 years. Call it 2.5 years. And each one is overlapped by a year. In other words, a year into part 1, we would begin part 2. So if you think about that overlap, that's 4 years plus 1.5 years. So ideally, it's 5.5 years to get all the way to the end. Now, the end is pretty dramatic. The end is vehicles that are delivery vehicles that might be delivering a human on an automated wheelchair can come to a curb, and all that automation from stopping at the curb to letting that wheelchair out, perhaps the quadriplegic has no control at all of the vehicle, and the vehicle's totally automated, goes onto the sidewalk and proceeds its work. Or more frequently, a delivery vehicle which arrives somewhere near a multiple point delivery and releases sidewalk drones. Forget about part 4 for now. That's really in the future. But what's not terribly in the future is part 2 and 3. Right now, part 2 is for today's ride-hailing vehicles and automated vehicles. Part 3 is really for the sidewalk drones, which have started. They are operating provisionally in some areas. There's already been an incident of a sidewalk drone blocking a person on a wheelchair, preventing her from getting up onto the curb because it was standing in that sloped place of the corner at the intersection where the textured sidewalk is for people who are blind, and her way was blocked and she was stuck on the roadway and so on. So there's urgency to finish these 3 parts. So that is a 4-year perspective. Now, the good news is we had our first meeting yesterday, and the group of people that are working on this are not only understanding and eager to see it happen, but there's a new collaboration starting after this. Well, it started about a year ago, but it's going to be accelerated now to create the entire data structure that's needed for all of these things. So there's going to be some acceleration of what has to happen on the basis. I showed that slide. So the short answer is 4 years. the long answer is it's a lot of work between now and then.
Thanks for that, Bern. I have a couple questions revolving around accessibility. So I'm going to ask them both for you. First of all, any further considerations for people with disabilities? And then how do you make sure you get the appropriate stakeholders to the table for accessibility?
I'm going to answer the second question first, and that's what these webinars are about, getting all the appropriate stakeholders there. There's been a lot of people from the disability environment that have been invited and are aware of it here in Canada anyway. We'd like some more in the US and more in Europe as well. But nonetheless, that's how we do that. Now, what I do want to say about disability is very complicated. Somebody with a sight problem might need to have sounds occur. So, for example, there might have to be special sounds coming from a vehicle that is a robotaxi picking a person up that has vision problems, for example. Perhaps someone who has hearing problems needs to have lights. Perhaps on a sidewalk drone needs to be lit and flashing in a certain way so that people who, have hearing problems are aware of them. So they're not, surprised by them or thrown off balance because of them and so on. There's a lot of things like that. Again, we're not going to specify the colors and the lights and the brightness and the flashing and so on, but we have to specify that there will be something for those circumstances. But there's many circumstances for. I mean, how long should a robotaxi wait? It's waiting for a rider, and those systems might have timeouts. If the rider doesn't show up, it might leave. Well, what if the person is on a walker and it's taking a long time to reach the vehicle, and the vehicle times out and departs? All sorts of scenarios. You can imagine hundreds of them that need to be considered so that we don't have incidences and failures and disappointments and injuries and so on. So that's why disability is a key element here, and that's why we need stakeholders for that. So if that person that asked that question is in that industry, please join. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bern. Next question is, my concern is the ability to herd cats. What I mean is, what has been the what has been the result of your outreach to existing solution providers who are already tackling the curb management market?
Well, interestingly, one of our biggest fans happens to be in that industry in the UK. So I have to say that the response we've received so far is stronger in the UK than it is in the United States. Full stop. I'll let that go. Now, there has been, the very first response is, oh, we're already doing that. And the reason is that it sounded to many people like I'm talking about I'm going to map the curb, and I'm not going to map the curb. In fact, I'm assuming that the curb is already mapped. I'm actually not, I'm not setting out any of the things in the light blue. I'm not mapping or enforcing or parking standards. And that was another thing, that there's an enormous effort for parking standards, and the assumption was, well, we're already doing that. And I'm saying, I'm glad you're doing that because I'm based on top of that. So I'm actually talking about real-time operations. I'm not talking about pricing. I'm not talking about mapping. All that has to be in place. What I'm talking about cannot be done unless all those other things are already finished. So it's been hard to describe that, because what I've been defining for the last 8 months is a little bit surprising. People hadn't always considered that these kinds of digitalized operations need to be considered if you're going to have automated vehicles. Right now, we struggle through non-automated vehicles, but that's not going to work if they're automated. Most of us use social constraints to manage the curb now. For example, if there's conflicts between two vehicles, the single most commonly used thing is the middle finger, and that doesn't work with robots. And so we have to actually have timing and bumping and queuing and so on. Anyway, I'm over answering that question, but it is not at all the same as what's already occurring from things such as like a Coord, an Esri, an Inrix, Passport, Appiway. Many companies are doing this mapping. We're not doing that.
Thanks for that answer, Bern. It's a really important distinction, and it's clear that this is built on top of all of that good work.
Yep.
Right now, I'm going to go and unmute Mohammed Tabish Bilal. He's got his hand up, so I'm unmuting you now, Mohammed. Can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me too?
Loud and clear. Thank you.
Good. First of all, I would like to thank you. Thanks to Bern. It's a wonderful presentation, and he explained everything very well. My concern is because I am a PhD candidate and researcher in Italy from University of Genoa. So, and I'm working on sustainable urban mobility with respect to the modeling of autonomous vehicles. My concern is, as he described in the previous question, that he is not going to map the curb, or they are not going into those details, but they are going to provide the standards to allow the autonomous vehicles to work on them, to operate on them. But the concern for me is, although they are not going to map, but while they are providing the standards, they are going to use the backdrops of modeling, and there should be someone in the team that is concerned about the modeling techniques and all those stuff. But currently now, all the things are being modeled and being done by considering that the autonomous vehicles will be fully autonomous in the next 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. Well, while it's not going to happen like this, for now, nobody is taking care of the thing that autonomous vehicles are continuously changing capability vehicles. So how this thing or this point will be included in these standards, that they are continuously learning vehicles. So how these things will be included in these standards?
So thank you. A very complex question. So there's two major elements. So first of all, this issue, let me see where that is. This issue of the standard not specifying mapping, the standard would specify which mapping standards are already in place. So just as an example, there's a group, there's a standard just released last year called Kerb LR. I don't know if that's the best one, the last one, the only one. I don't know how much it will improve. I don't know how heavily it will be adopted. That's secondary, but there will be one that's adopted, and there will be one that is considered the best mapping standard, the best way to express the maps. And that's what we're going to, whichever one that is, and we can wait another year and a half until that's decided. That's what we would adopt from the mapping. That's what I'm saying. We are not saying how that's going to work. We're going to adopt how that's being already established by many people who are very competent in that domain. I think that's the major issue about that. Now, your second issue, much bigger issue. Technology is changing all the time. How can you possibly write a standard now if you don't understand what the technology is going to be doing? So we're not writing a standard for technology. We're writing a standard, for example, just take just a simple instance of reservations. Well, I can create a reservation. It can be for my my brother's an Uber driver, and he's just simply using his car, and he asks for a spot, and then he's assigned a spot. And then in 30 years, there's a whole other unimaginably different vehicle that's automated, and it asks for a spot and reserves a spot. So the activity of reserving a spot doesn't matter whether it's automated or not. It doesn't matter how sophisticated the automation is. It just matters that there's a vehicle of a certain size, and it wants to arrive at a certain time, and it wants to drop off a certain amount of goods or people. And all of those things can be defined in the standard now, even though the person is in a vehicle from 2060, it's still a human being delivered by a vehicle. And the only thing that changes is maybe the dimensions of the vehicle are different, or maybe the vehicle is floating on air, but that doesn't matter. So we don't care how fast the technology changes. What we do care is that we have to interoperate with human operation and machine operation. That's the hard problem. We have to be able to operate in mixed environments. I hope I've answered that, Mohammed.
Yeah, it's perfectly very nice answer, and I'm satisfied with that. Thank you so much for your answer.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'm just going to mute you now, and I'm going to go to the list of questions again. For sidewalk robots operating at roughly walking speed, has there been conversations with Canadian lawmakers, either at the provincial or federal level? And there's a follow-up comment in terms of restrictions on robots on sidewalks over the next year or two.
I'm not aware of them. I'm sure there's been discussions, but I'm not aware of them. And I will assert that there's not been decisions made, but that's just an assertion, not a known fact. Have I covered the whole question? Is there more to that?
I think, yeah, okay. So let's just assume that you've covered the question, and if there's a follow-up to that, we'll get to that in the list. I do have a comment. It would be useful to get a sense who is on the call and the sectors represented. And I can, before you answer that question, Bern, I can tell everyone that this is our third webinar. We've run one over once a week for the last 3 weeks, and we've had at least 100 people at the last two, and today we're sitting at around 50 people. So, and in terms of the breakout of the mix of population, Bern, I think you probably have a better handle on that.
Yeah, I'm going to say that in looking, this is just from memory. I haven't done a formal count, but it's about just under half are municipal in some way or another. It's a huge municipal issue, of course. There have been planners. There have been maybe about 15% of them have been makers of one kind or another, either software for mapping. There's been a few people from parking standards and parking industry. There's been a couple of automotive makers as well. I haven't seen any scooter. So I mean, maybe there has been, but I haven't noticed any. And I haven't seen enough logistics. This has been, interestingly, very little. I think logistics is so busy they don't have time to think about the future, but that might be a silly comment. But that's been missing. But very, very heavily municipal is the single largest subset.
Thanks for that, Bern. Moving down the list, you mentioned curb coding. Do you have any preliminary advice for municipalities and transit agencies regarding RE defining types of curb and stopping areas in a standardized fashion? Thanks in advance.
The best two that I'm going to say right now, I mean, there's companies like Kerb and Inrix, and I mentioned them in a previous slide, about 5 or 6 companies, and I don't think that's even half of the companies that are doing this, because there's a lot in Europe that are not in that list. Appiway is from England, is in that list. So there's many companies doing it. So first of all, find out what those companies are doing and see what they're saying and claiming to give you some ideas. Secondly, I'm going to say that I'm impressed very much with what Kerb LR has done. You can look that up and you can find that standard, and you can see what it is that they're measuring and how they describe those measurements. Then again, there's companies that are actually performing the actual measurements and mapping and so on. So I think there's a lot being done, and I think what a municipality that wants to say, you know, what ought we be thinking about, ought to do research that way. I can help them with it, but that's not really what was being asked. What's being asked is how should we think about it? So do that research, and I think you need to then ask yourself what it is why do we want to map all this stuff? Do we want to be concerned about goods delivery and people delivery with these? In other words, we're a larger city. We have areas that are under stress, congestion stress, because of deliveries of people and goods. Then the answer is, I think you should map it and start thinking about what you're going to do to manage that in a digitized fashion. If you're a small town, maybe you don't have that problem. There's a lot of small towns where parking is free and nobody cares, and so on. But anything from mid-size up has to start thinking about this. So I would start that way.
Thanks, Bern. Just for everybody on the call, it is now 15 minutes before the hour, and we did commit to being or wrapping up at this time. There are still a few more questions, and Bern and I are going to stick around and answer all of your questions right up until the hour. If some of you need to drop off, we completely understand, and we're just going to continue answering questions. Okay, so on to the next one, Bern. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. As you note, cities are facing an immediate challenge/need to digitize and manage the curb within brackets, or risk being outpaced by users and failing to meet constituents' needs. With a timeline that stretches to 2022 plus to publish the work product of part 1, how can cities take meaningful steps in the interim?
I'm going to say the same answer as before. So I put back up on the screen a list of companies that, let's see, you can see on the left. These are just, so Cord, Esri, Enrix, Passport, these are North American companies that are doing these things. You can find out about those online. Happy Way is in, it happens to be in England. Again, not the only ones. So it's not necessarily you need to call them, but I would look at what they do and understand what their services are about. But even before that, really think, again, same answer before, think about what you want to do and go and look, not because Kerb LR is going to be a service to you, but the Kerb LR describes what the mapping process is in their terms. And that gives you some ideas about what to look for, think about, and ask if you want to find a company to help you with that. By the way, that's not something that our firm does. You have to go to one of those other firms.
Thanks, Bern. Next question. Do you envision transit stops remaining for exclusive use of transit vehicles in an AV future? If not, how would this sharing take place?
All right, that can go either way. So in other words, if you have, for example, a bus system, well, I'm talking about the same sort of 50-foot buses, municipal buses, or even tandem buses and so on that have stops in areas that, in other words, stops that pull over by the curb, not stops that stop in the middle of the street. So they actually need curb space. A city would say that's reserved only for a bus, or a city can say when the bus is not arriving, because we're digitalizing, we know when the bus is arriving. So the bus is not arriving for 15 minutes. We can provide 4-minute spots. We can provide 4-minute spots to robotaxis in the meantime. So in other words, it's possible in a digitalized world to share that space. How that space is shared or whether it would be shared is a municipal decision. City council makes those kinds of, planners make those kind of decisions, not the standard. The standard will have language to permit the sharing of that space. But whether it's shared, it's none of the standard's business.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go to voice question. I've got a question here from Sergio Delara. And Sergio, I just unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Yes, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good, good. Bern, just quick question. As you know, I'm with Mars and we work on inclusive urban innovation. So I'm wondering what approach or method you're going to use to ensure equitative stakeholder representation, because as you demonstrated in your slide, you're looking for sponsors, and sponsors have the opportunity to provide input. But for example, pedestrian or cyclist organizations don't have the same amount of money as Uber does, or automotive organizations, accessibility organizations, even municipal governments don't have as much money as many major manufacturers of automated vehicles or delivery companies. So what steps are you taking to ensure?
So two answers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to answer your second question first, which is on the screen, sponsorship levels. So you're right, Uber, well, I don't know how much
Mhm.
Uber's suffering for money now too, as well,
Yes.
of course, you know. But nonetheless, commercial entities, of course, have more than the cycling group, for example. So cycling group is not for profit. We ask only for a very modest fee for the not-for-profit. It's not token, but it's very little, so that we can hear their input. I want to stress that the Commercial Municipal Industry Association not-for-profit are tiered from a commercial is, of course, the highest, and the not-for-profit is the lowest. That's part of the answer. I want to stress that the input from all four is the same. Just because somebody pays more to be a sponsor, their input is equally weighted. The reason for the difference in price is because the commercial entities are monetizing the term curb. So FedEx is going to monetize that curb by using it to make its deliveries. And so they would pay more than the bicycle group that's not monetizing the curb, but they're just looking out for rights of its users, for example. So that's the second part of your question. The first part is, how do we maintain a balance? What we're looking for is a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3 from each. So in other words, it doesn't make sense to have 30 municipalities on this. I mean, I wouldn't send them away, but we really want 1 or 2 of each. That's so we have a balance. That's why I made the point that when we have our quarterly meetings, it's important that everybody hears everybody else. So if a logistics firm was on that meeting and then somebody from the Bicycle Association asks for something in the standard, then they understand what that's about. So that's kind of a third answer to your question, but very important question, that balance. Thank you.
Sergio, did that answer your question?
Yes, to a degree. It just prompted a bit of a second question, because an ISO standard is, well, an international standard. And so even from the municipal perspective, there's lots of different viewpoints from Japan to Florida to Barcelona, like the perspectives, priorities, the mindsets. So I'm wondering how you'd cover all these different perspectives with like 1 or 3 stakeholders from these categories.
Right. So back to your issue about, I'm trying to find out where I have the ISO. So on this ISO part here, Japan's already involved in that on the right-hand side. So in other words, the country differences get absorbed in the ISO because this cannot proceed without at least 5 countries, and there's already more than that have voted to say that this is important. Your first part of your question is, this is an international standard. What about, like you're from Toronto, what about Toronto? So Toronto has its specific issues. It sure does. And how that works is that this is not a standard for how to behave. This is not a standard that says that a robotaxi can stop for 6 minutes. It's not a standard that says there's got to be 12 spaces. There's a standard that says if there's going to be a space, you have to describe the space. If there's going to be n spaces, you have to describe n. If there's going to be a time limit, you have to describe the time limit. And if there's going to be a fee for it, you have to describe the fee. But that fees and time limits and counts and numbers are set locally. So a city says, Barcelona says, we want all of our blocks to have at least 2 spots and at most 6, whatever. I just made those numbers up. Barcelona makes those numbers up. We don't. We're just providing, basically, we're providing the language and the protocol for those decisions to be made locally. Now, those local decisions go up into a service. That service might be local. Maybe a city like Toronto has its own, or maybe there's a service in Ontario, or maybe there's a service in North America. I don't know. It's been undetermined. Some very, very large companies are looking at this for that purpose, because they would write that system. That would write. It's almost like an air traffic control system, it's ground traffic control system, very complex systems. So those would be written using those protocols, but they would be populated. The numbers would be populated locally. Sergio, I'd love to talk to you more about this, because we're not far. Jerry and I are not far from Mars, and we're involved. And it would please us to no end to come and visit you and take you through an in-depth tour of this, because some of the work has already started. and see how you want to proceed, because I know you are especially interested in autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, I'd love that. There's a few more questions I'd like to ask, but I think that'd be a better opportunity to let other people ask questions for now.
And we can stay on even now. Let's see what other questions there are, Jerry, and then we'll come back to Sergio at the end.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Sergio. And I'm going to mute you now and go back to my list. So I have a quick question here that I can quickly answer. Will participants have access to the slideshow after the presentation? And the answer is yes. We're going to be sending the slide deck as well as a recording of the webinar for you to review following this event once it's available. Next question, in the interim, thinking about what needs to be achieved, companies like us, Grid Smarter Cities, are offering an interim solution to do some of the heavy lifting with a booking platform to help work with existing operations, enforcement and mapping, etc. And I've got a URL, www.kerb.uk.com. So I'm not sure if that's really.
I was muted. What's the question? The question is, what would the standard do about those existing services, or?
So thinking about what needs to be achieved, companies like us, Grid Smarter Cities, are offering an interim solution to do some of the heavy lifting.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Now, there's several companies offering interim. I'm aware of Grid Smart Cities work. So first of all, that work has to continue because there's a need for it yesterday. This isn't something that can wait for 3 years. What is the case is that what I hope to happen is that those companies that are working on it now become stakeholders in this standard to make sure that the standard provides all the requirements that they already have established. Those firms understand not everything about this, but they understand big pieces of it and are already working on it and providing services. So those companies ought to be concerned that the standard, when it becomes in place, is something that they can work with very, very little modification, hopefully with very little modification to what they're already doing, and that they can further expand their existing services because the standard opens up that common basis for communications. So that's what I'm hoping happens with the firms that are doing that work now. I hope that answers that question.
That's great, Bern. And we're just getting to the top of the hour, and I've gotten to the bottom of my list of questions. And so if there's nothing else, first of all, I'd really like to thank all of you for being with us today. The conversation, the questions, it all just further strengthens our ability to take this project on, and you being generous asking those questions is also answering the questions that some other people on the call maybe didn't ask or were considering. So really thanks a lot for your active participation. Bern, any closing comments?
Well, I just to confirm, thank you for all the same reasons, Jerry, that you just mentioned. Thank you, everybody, for that. I'm still willing to stay. So, and I think that Sergio had possibly further questions, but anybody else, all of my answers are public answers. So, Jerry, if you want to close off formally, then I'll still be here.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten to the bottom of our list of questions, and I think that we can take this offline with Sergio. And we did commit to be done at the top of the hour, which is right about now. So I don't have any other questions in the list, and so I think it's just time to say goodbye and thank you. And of course, you have our email addresses and our contact information. If there's anything else that we can help you with, we'd love to hear from you. And just once again, thanks for being with us today.
Do we want to stay for Sergio, or we're gonna